The church potluck was in full swing when I realized James was gone. His chair sat empty, his coffee growing cold, his dinner plate untouched. James never left food on his plate. Never. "Mrs. Thompson?" Betty Morrison appeared at my elbow, her voice tight with concern. "James stepped outside about 20 minutes ago, said he needed some air, but—" The parking lot stretched before me, dimly lit by the church's old street lamps. Our blue Buick sat in its usual spot near the handicap spaces. James always parked there, not because we needed it, but because the walk was shorter for the elderly members he helped inside each week. I found him slumped over the steering wheel. The engine wasn't running. His hands rested peacefully in his lap, and for one hopeful moment I thought he'd simply dozed off waiting for me. But his skin had that waxy pallor I'd seen too many times in my nursing days. His chest didn't rise and fall with the steady rhythm I'd listened to for 43 years. His right hand clutched something, a business card crumpled and damp with perspiration. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their efficient movements confirming what I already knew. "Massive coronary," one said. "Instantaneous. He wouldn't have suffered." Their words floated around me like smoke, meaningless sounds that couldn't penetrate the roaring in my ears. But I managed to slip that business card into my purse before anyone noticed. Web development. Final notice, written across the back in James's careful handwriting. The ink was fresh, the words urgent. David's car pulled into the parking lot before the ambulance doors even closed. Odd, since I hadn't called him yet. His shirt hung wrinkled and untucked, his usually perfect hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it. But his eyes were sharp, alert, focused. "Mom, did Dad say anything to you before—" He grabbed my shoulders, his grip too tight. "Did he give you anything?" Did anyone else see what happened out here? Jennifer materialized beside him, her makeup flawless despite supposedly rushing from home. Her lipstick was perfect, not a hair out of place. Her designer purse clutched against her chest like armor. She didn't ask about James, didn't offer comfort or sympathy. "We need to handle the arrangements efficiently," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Protect Mom from unnecessary stress during this difficult time." A crowd gathered as word spread through the church. Friends surrounded me with hugs and casseroles and promises of prayer. But I watched my family move through the chaos like they'd rehearsed this moment. David spoke in low tones with the paramedics while Jennifer collected James's belongings from the car. His reading glasses, his coffee thermos, his worn leather wallet. Tommy stood apart from his parents, tears streaming down his 10-year-old face. Real tears, honest grief. He was the only one actually crying. Pastor Williams approached with gentle words about God's mysterious plan and James's faithful service. But my attention fixed on Jennifer as she slipped James's wallet into her purse. Our eyes met across the crowd. Her smile never wavered, perfectly composed, but her hand moved protectively over the leather billfold like she was guarding a secret. The business card seemed to burn against my palm through the fabric of my purse. Whatever James had discovered in those final moments, whatever had made him clutch that card as his heart gave out, someone else in this parking lot already knew about it. The front door of our house stood exactly as I'd left it that morning, locked, with the porch light glowing yellow against the darkness. But stepping inside felt like entering someone else's home. The familiar scent of James's aftershave still lingered in the hallway, mixing with the faint smell of the apple pie I'd never gotten to serve him. I hung my purse on the hook by the door, my fingers still clutching that business card. The house stretched before me, too quiet, too empty. 43 years of shared meals and morning coffee and evening television programs, and now silence pressed against my eardrums like water. I walked to James's study first, drawn by habit to the room where he'd spent his final hours. Everything looked normal. His desk sat neat and organized, just the way he'd always kept it. His favorite coffee mug rested beside his computer, half filled with cold coffee that had grown a thin film on top. The morning newspaper lay folded to the crossword puzzle. 3 clues filled in with his careful handwriting. But something nagged at me as I stood in the doorway. The papers on his desk sat in slightly different positions than I remembered. James was meticulous about his filing system insurance documents in the left corner, bills in the center, personal correspondence on the right. Now the insurance folder rested where the bills should be, and the bills had shifted toward the personal letters. I moved closer, studying the bookshelf that lined the far wall. James arranged his books alphabetically, a habit that had driven me crazy when we were newlyweds but had become endearing over the decades. Now the volumes sat askew, returned to their proper shelves but not in proper order. His biography of Abraham Lincoln sat between a cookbook and a gardening manual. The wedding photo on his desk had moved too. I knew because the dust outline remained on the wooden surface, a perfect rectangle showing where the frame had sat for years. Someone had picked it up, examined it, then placed it an inch to the right of its original position. My hands trembled as I reached for his desk drawer. James kept everything important in that top drawer: appointment books, insurance papers, the spare checkbook we used for household expenses. The metal handle felt cold under my palm as I pulled it open. His appointment book lay inside, but pages were missing. Torn out cleanly, leaving only the thin strips of paper still caught in the spiral binding. The last 2 weeks of his life, gone entirely. I flipped through the remaining pages, finding his careful notations about dental appointments, church meetings, and our weekly grocery trips, but nothing recent, nothing that might explain the business card burning a hole in my purse. I turned to his computer, the old desktop machine he'd been so proud of buying 5 years ago. The screensaver showed photos of our family, Tommy's school plays, Christmas mornings, vacation trips to the lake. I moved the mouse and the screen came to life, showing his browser still open to multiple tabs. Property development contracts, elder law attorneys, estate planning in Ohio. The search terms made my stomach clench, but when I clicked on the browser history, it ended abruptly 3 days before his death. Someone had deleted everything recent, wiping away whatever James had been researching in his final days. But James had been smarter than whoever cleaned up after him. I remembered him showing me the automatic backup folder, explaining how the computer saved copies of everything in case something went wrong. My fingers felt clumsy on the keyboard as I navigated to the hidden folder, praying I remembered the steps correctly. Screenshots filled the screen, legal documents with web development letterhead, property maps showing parcels of land throughout the county, contract proposals with figures that made my breath catch, hundreds of thousands of dollars for properties that should have been worth far less. One screenshot showed a list of names, elderly residents I recognized from church and the grocery store. Next to each name was a status: acquired, in progress, or resistant. My heart hammered as I read down the list, finding familiar faces from our community, people whose property had been sold in recent months for far less than market value. James's name appeared at the bottom of the list, marked as resistant. I printed everything, the old inkjet printer wheezing and grinding as it slowly produced copies of each document. The business card felt heavier in my purse as patterns emerged from the screenshots. Web development wasn't just buying property. They were targeting elderly homeowners specifically, using tactics that looked suspiciously like fraud. By 11 o'clock, I'd gathered a stack of printed evidence that painted a picture I didn't want to believe. I made myself a cup of tea, my hands shaking as I poured the hot water, and settled into the kitchen to study everything more carefully. The motion sensor lights in our backyard suddenly blazed to life. I set down my teacup, the china rattling against the saucer. Through the kitchen window, I could see a figure moving through James's workshop shed, the beam of a flashlight cutting through the darkness. The silhouette was too small to be a man, too careful and deliberate to be a burglar. Jennifer. I pressed myself against the kitchen wall, peering around the edge of the window frame. David stood by the back fence, his phone glowing as he checked it repeatedly, his head turning left and right like a sentry on watch. They thought I was asleep, thought they could search freely through James's private space. Jennifer emerged from the shed empty-handed, her flashlight beam sweeping across the yard in frustration. She walked to David, and their voices carried across the still night air, hushed but urgent enough for me to catch fragments. "It has to be here somewhere," Jennifer hissed, her usual polished tone replaced by something sharp and desperate. The old man was too smart to leave it at the garage. "Maybe he hid it in the house," David replied, his voice tense with worry. "We might have missed something. We've been through every room twice, every drawer, every closet, every hiding place we could think of. Been through every room, twice." My knees went weak as the reality hit me. They hadn't just come tonight. They'd been in my house before, searching while I was at the hospital, at the church, anywhere but home. Going through James's belongings, my belongings, looking for something specific. "The lawyer's office tomorrow," Jennifer continued, her voice barely audible now. "If it's not here, it has to be with that old friend of his. Brennan won't tell us anything. Attorney-client privilege. Then we'll have to be more persuasive." They moved toward the front of the house, their footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. Car doors slammed, an engine started, and headlights swept across my kitchen window as they drove away. I waited in the darkness for 10 minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs, before I dared to move. Using my own flashlight, I walked to the back porch, checking the areas where they'd been walking. A muddy footprint marked the wooden boards near the door, fresh soil from James's garden beds ground into the grain of the wood. But what made my blood turn to ice was the discovery beside it. My spare house key was gone. The ceramic frog that had sat beside our back door for 15 years, hiding that key underneath for emergencies, had been moved 6 inches to the left. The key was missing entirely. They hadn't just searched tonight. They'd been coming and going for days, maybe weeks, using my own key to enter whenever they pleased. Walking through my home while I slept, while I grieved, while I trusted them to help me through the worst time of my life. But what were they looking for that was important enough to risk everything? Harold Brennan's law office smelled of old leather and fresh coffee, the kind of place that felt safe and unchanging in a world that had tilted sideways overnight. I clutched my purse against my chest as his secretary ushered me into the familiar mahogany-paneled room where James and I had signed our wills, planned our estate, celebrated small legal victories over the years. Harold rose from behind his massive oak desk, his silver hair combed back in the same style he'd worn for the 30 years I'd known him. His handshake was firm, but his eyes held a sadness that went deeper than professional sympathy. "Maggie, I'm so sorry about James. I should have been at the church last night, but I was working late on—" He stopped himself, gestured toward the client chair. "Please, sit down." I pulled the business card from my purse, my fingers trembling as I placed it on his desk between us. "I found this in James's hand when he died." "Can you tell me what it means?" Harold's face darkened the moment he saw Webb's name. The color drained from his cheeks, and his jaw tightened in a way that made him look older, more fragile than his 72 years. "Where exactly did you find this?" His voice was careful, controlled, like a man trying not to reveal too much too quickly. James was clutching it. He'd written on the back, "Final notice." "Harold, I need to know what's going on." Harold leaned back in his leather chair, the springs creaking under his weight. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a thick manila folder, and set it down with the weight of a confession. "James has been coming to see me every week for the past 3 months," he said, his fingers drumming against the folder's edge. "He was receiving threats, Maggie. Not about selling property, but about being forced to sell. That card you found isn't an offer, it's an ultimatum." My mouth went dry. "Threats?" "Phone calls at all hours. Letters delivered to your mailbox in the middle of the night. Someone even approached him in the church parking lot demanding he reconsider what they called his stubborn refusal to be reasonable." Harold opened the folder, revealing photocopies of handwritten notes, transcripts of recorded phone conversations, detailed logs in James's careful penmanship. "Your husband was documenting everything. He was frightened, Maggie, more frightened than I'd ever seen him. I stared at the evidence spread across Harold's desk. James, my methodical, careful James, had been living in fear for months while I remained completely oblivious. The man who'd never hidden anything from me in 43 years of marriage had been protecting me from something so dangerous he couldn't even share the burden. But threats about what? We don't own any valuable property, just the house, and it's been paid off for years. Harold's expression grew heavier. He pulled out a different set of documents, legal papers with official seals and signatures I recognized as James's careful handwriting. That's where you're wrong, Maggie. James inherited much more than just your home when his brother Frank died 2 years ago. The documents he showed me felt surreal, like reading about someone else's life. Property deeds, business licenses, tax records, all bearing James's name, all dated within the past 24 months. Frank's old automotive repair garage had been transferred to James, along with several acres of commercial land on the outskirts of town, but that wasn't the shocking part. James wasn't just maintaining the property, Harold continued, pulling out financial statements that made my head spin. He'd been running a vintage car restoration business for 2 years. Very successful, very profitable. The garage was generating substantial monthly income from wealthy collectors who paid premium prices for Frank's restoration work that James had learned to continue. The numbers on the bank statement seemed impossible. Monthly deposits of $8,000, $10,000, sometimes $15,000, an account balance that had grown to over $200,000 in just 2 years of operation. But Harold, James never said anything about running a business. He never mentioned extra income, never. He wanted to surprise you, Harold said gently. The plan was to tell you on your 45th wedding anniversary next month. He'd restored 5 classic automobiles completely, each one worth well over $100,000. The garage and its contents are valued at more than $600,000 total. $600,000. My James, who clipped coupons and wore the same winter coat for 15 years, had been secretly building a fortune that could have changed our entire retirement. But someone has been sabotaging the business, Harold continued, his voice growing darker. Stealing expensive parts, intimidating customers, vandalizing completed restorations. James had to install security cameras and hire a part-time guard just to protect his work. I thought about the screenshots I'd found on James's computer, the list of elderly property owners marked as acquired or resistant. The pattern was becoming clearer, more sinister than I'd imagined. This Webb person, he targets older people specifically. Harold nodded grimly. Marcus Webb specializes in acquiring properties from elderly owners through what he calls motivation techniques. Legal pressure, family manipulation, sometimes outright intimidation. James wasn't his first target, and unfortunately, he wouldn't have been his last. He pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the first. Inside were police reports, court documents, newspaper clippings, a trail of suspicious property sales stretching back 5 years. Elderly couples who'd sold valuable land for far below market value. Widows who'd signed over family properties within weeks of their husbands' deaths, a pattern of predatory behavior that had made Webb very wealthy and left his victims financially devastated. But James was fighting back, I said, remembering the determined set of his jaw when he worked on projects he cared about. More than fighting back. He'd been building a case against Webb's entire operation. Those documents you found on his computer were just the beginning. James had been coordinating with other victims, gathering evidence, preparing to file both criminal and civil charges that would have destroyed Webb's business permanently. Harold paused, studying my face carefully before continuing. There's something else, Maggie. Something that makes this situation even more complicated. He handed me a legal document I'd never seen before, signed with David's name in bold black ink. Your son has power of attorney over James's medical decisions. This was filed 6 months ago, apparently with James's consent, though I was never involved in preparing the paperwork. The document felt cold in my hands. David had never mentioned having power of attorney. James had never discussed signing such papers. Yet here was legal proof that our son had been given authority over his father's healthcare decisions, authority that included the right to make end-of-life choices. "I never signed this," I whispered. "James never told me about this." "I didn't prepare this document," Harold said carefully, "which means David used a different attorney, someone who might not have been as careful about ensuring both spouses were properly informed." My hands shook as the implications settled over me. David had been positioned to make medical decisions for his father. Jennifer worked part-time at the county clerk's office, giving her access to property records and the ability to file or alter official documents. Marcus Webb had been pressuring James for months, escalating to threats when persuasion failed, and James had died suddenly, clutching evidence of their conspiracy. "Harold, you don't think—" I couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the suspicion that had been growing in my mind since I'd found that business card. "I think your husband was a very smart man who knew he was in danger," Harold said quietly, "and I think he took precautions to protect both you and his work, precautions that we need to understand immediately." He was reaching for another folder when his office door burst open. His secretary, usually calm and professional, stood in the doorway with her face flushed and her hands trembling. "Mr. Brennan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this immediately." She held up an official-looking document, her voice shaking with urgency. "Someone just filed papers at the county courthouse claiming Mr. Thompson sold the garage property before his death. The deed transfer is already in the official records." Harold snatched the document from her hands, his eyes scanning the legal text with the speed of 40 years' practice. His face went pale, then red with anger. "This is impossible. James would never have sold that property without telling me, without telling you." He looked up at me, his eyes blazing with professional fury. "This deed is dated 3 days before James died, but the signatures look freshly forged." The secretary wrung her hands. "There's more, sir. The new owners filed an immediate possession order. They're planning to take physical control of the property first thing tomorrow morning." Harold shot to his feet, papers scattering across his desk. "Get Judge Morrison on the phone. File an emergency injunction. Contact the sheriff's office and—" "Sir," the secretary interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Judge Morrison signed the possession order an hour ago." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Harold's grandfather clock. I watched my husband's closest friend realize that the corruption had spread further than any of us had imagined, that the very officials meant to protect justice had been compromised. Harold sank back into his chair, his face gray with the weight of understanding. "Maggie, they're not just trying to steal James's property. They're trying to erase all evidence that it ever belonged to him. If they take possession tomorrow morning, everything James worked for, everything he died protecting, will disappear forever." The business card on his desk seemed to mock us now, its simple message carrying the weight of an executed threat. James had clutched that final notice as his heart gave out, knowing that his time had run out, knowing that everything he'd built was about to be stolen from the woman he'd spent his life protecting. And they had until morning to make it all legal. The county clerk's office at midnight felt like stepping into a mausoleum. Maria Santos unlocked the side entrance with keys that jangled in the silence, her nervous energy filling the empty hallway as she led Harold and me past darkened offices and sleeping computers. "I've been suspicious of Jennifer for months," Maria whispered, her voice echoing off the marble floors. Property files checked out after hours, official seals missing from storage, blank deed forms disappearing from the secured cabinet. She stopped at Jennifer's workstation, a cramped desk piled with manila folders and legal documents. "When I saw the deed transfer this afternoon, I knew it had to be her work." Harold pulled on latex gloves and began examining the forged document under Maria's desk lamp. His trained eye moved across every line, every signature, every official stamp that had been used to legitimize the theft of James's property. "The paper stock is wrong," he muttered, holding the deed up to the light. "This is standard copy paper, not the bonded stock the county uses for official documents. And look at this." He pointed to James's signature at the bottom of the page. "The pen pressure is too uniform, too perfect. This was traced, not written naturally." Maria opened Jennifer's desk drawer, revealing a collection of official county seals, blank forms, and several sheets of paper, covered with practice signatures. James's name appeared dozens of times in Jennifer's handwriting, each attempt growing closer to his actual signature until the final versions were nearly perfect forgeries. "She's been practicing for weeks," Maria said, her voice tight with disgust. "I found these hidden under her desk blotter yesterday, but I didn't understand what they meant until I saw the property transfer." Harold photographed everything with his phone, the camera flash illuminating evidence that would destroy Jennifer's carefully constructed facade. But we needed more than just proof of forgery. We needed the original documents that proved James had never sold the garage. "The real deed should be in the secured files," Maria said, leading us deeper into the building's maze of record rooms. If Jennifer filed the forgery, she would have had to remove or destroy the original to avoid detection. The secured file room required 2 keys and a security code that Maria entered with shaking fingers. Inside, rows of metal filing cabinets stretched from floor to ceiling, containing decades of property records and legal documents that form the backbone of our county's official history. But when Maria opened the drawer that should have contained James's original property deed, we found nothing but empty manila folders and gaps where documents should have been filed. "She destroyed them," Harold said grimly. Jennifer removed every trace of James's legitimate ownership to make her forgery the only record on file. My heart sank as I realized how thoroughly they had planned this theft. Jennifer's position at the county clerk's office hadn't been just a part-time job. It had been a strategic placement that gave her access to destroy evidence and create fraudulent documents with official authority. But Harold wasn't ready to give up. "We still have James's copy of the deed," he said. "And more importantly, we have his business records. If we can get to the garage, we can gather evidence that proves he was the legitimate owner and operator of a thriving business." The drive to James's garage took 20 minutes through empty streets and darkened neighborhoods. I clutched the spare key I'd found taped inside James's toolbox at home, a key he'd hidden so carefully that even I hadn't known of its existence until tonight. The garage sat in darkness on a lot much larger than I'd expected, surrounded by a chain-link fence that gleamed silver in Harold's headlights. The building itself looked ordinary from the outside, a simple metal structure with 3 bay doors and a small office attached to one side. But as we approached the entrance, I could see signs that this was no abandoned property. Security cameras mounted at each corner of the building tracked our movement. Motion sensors activated bright floodlights that turned night into day. A small sign by the door read, "Thompson Classic Automotive by appointment only," painted in the same careful lettering James used for all his projects. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and I stepped into my husband's secret world. The garage was immaculate, organized with the precision James brought to everything he cared about. 3 vintage automobiles sat in the main bays, each one gleaming under the overhead lights like jewels in a display case. A 1967 Mustang Shelby GT 500 in candy apple red, a 1969 Camaro Z28 in classic black with white racing stripes, a 1970 Plymouth Cuda in deep purple that seemed to glow with inner fire. But it was the 4th bay that took my breath away. A completely restored 1965 Ford Thunderbird convertible sat under a protective cover, and taped to the windshield was an envelope with my name written in James's careful handwriting. Inside the envelope was a birthday card for my upcoming 71st birthday, still 2 months away. "Happy birthday, my dearest Maggie," James had written. "45 years ago, you said yes to a mechanic with dirty fingernails and big dreams. This car is for all the Sunday drives we never took, all the adventures we postponed for practical things. It's time to stop being practical and start being adventurous. All my love, always, James." My legs gave out, and I sank into the nearest chair, clutching the card against my chest. James had been planning this surprise for months, maybe years. The successful business, the restored cars, the financial security, all of it, had been his way of giving us the retirement we'd never been able to afford. But as Harold and I explored deeper into the garage, we found evidence that someone had been trying to destroy everything James had built. The restoration logs showed appointment books filled with clients scheduled weeks in advance. Wealthy collectors from across the state had been bringing their vintage automobiles to James for his expert restoration work. Payment receipts documented monthly income that averaged $12,000, sometimes more during busy seasons. Yet scattered throughout the evidence of success were signs of systematic sabotage. 2 of the restored cars had slashed tires, the rubber cut cleanly with a sharp blade. Expensive chrome bumpers had been dented with what looked like a sledgehammer. The tool cabinet showed gaps where specialized equipment had been stolen, leaving James unable to complete certain types of work. A corkboard by the office door was covered with threatening notes, each one tucked under windshield wipers or slipped through the mail slot during the night. Close the business or face consequences. Old men should know when to quit. Last warning before serious action. But the most devastating discovery waited in James's private office, hidden behind what looked like a simple storage closet. Harold's flashlight revealed a false wall that concealed a small safe, the kind James had always said was unnecessary for people like us who had nothing valuable to protect. Inside the safe, I found the truth about my husband's final days. His medical records from his annual physical just 1 week before his death showed perfect health. Blood pressure normal, cholesterol levels excellent, heart function strong. Dr. Peterson's note specifically mentioned that James was in remarkable condition for a man his age and cleared for all normal activities without restriction. But underneath the medical records were pharmacy receipts that made my blood turn cold. Someone had been picking up prescriptions in James's name for powerful heart medications, digitalis, propranolol, other drugs I didn't recognize, but that carried warning labels about dangerous interactions and potential cardiac effects. The signatures on the prescription pickup slips matched David's handwriting perfectly. The dates corresponded exactly with his visits to our house, the times he'd claimed to be checking on Dad's health and bringing groceries or running errands for us. "Oh my God," Harold whispered, studying the receipts under his flashlight. "Maggie." These medications, if given to someone who doesn't need them, especially in combination, they could cause a heart attack, I finished, the words tasting like poison in my mouth. Harold nodded grimly. In someone with a healthy heart, these drugs could trigger cardiac arrest that would look completely natural. No autopsy would detect anything unusual unless they were specifically testing for these compounds. My son had been slowly poisoning his father, using his medical knowledge from his brief stint in nursing school. David had been administering drugs that would weaken James's heart and make him vulnerable to the fatal attack that had killed him at the church potluck. The business card James had clutched as he died suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't just evidence of Webb's threats. It was proof that James had discovered the plot against his life and had been trying to warn someone, trying to leave behind evidence of the conspiracy that was destroying him. Harold was photographing everything when his phone rang at 3:15 in the morning. His emergency injunction had been successful. A federal judge had issued a temporary restraining order preventing the property transfer until the forgery claims could be investigated properly. "We won," Harold said, relief flooding his voice. "The garage is safe until we can get this sorted out in court." But our celebration lasted exactly 12 minutes. Car doors slammed in the parking lot outside, followed by heavy footsteps and the crackle of police radios. Through the garage windows, I watched David emerge from the passenger seat of a sheriff's cruiser. His face set in the expression of righteous indignation I remembered from his teenage years when he'd been caught in lies. Sheriff Morrison, who'd been a friend of our family for 20 years, looked uncomfortable as he approached the garage entrance. Behind him walked two deputies I didn't recognize, their hands resting casually on their service weapons. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to step outside," Sheriff Morrison called through the door. "There's been a complaint filed claiming you're trespassing on private property." David stepped forward, holding a manila envelope thick with legal documents. His shirt was pressed and clean despite the early hour, his hair perfectly combed, his expression composed in a way that made him look like a concerned son protecting his elderly mother from her own poor judgment. "Mom, I know this is difficult for you, but Dad left specific instructions about his property." David's voice carried the patronizing tone he'd perfected over years of treating me like a child who couldn't understand adult matters. "This garage and everything in it legally belongs to me now. I have the will right here, properly witnessed and notarized." He handed Sheriff Morrison a document that looked official enough to be convincing. The sheriff scanned it quickly, his weathered face showing the strain of a man caught between friendship and duty. "This appears to be in order," Sheriff Morrison said reluctantly. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm afraid you'll need to leave the premises until this can be sorted out through proper legal channels." Harold stepped forward, his voice sharp with professional authority. "Sheriff, that will is fraudulent, just like the property deed. We have evidence that—" "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Brennan," David interrupted smoothly. "I understand Mom is grieving and might be confused about Dad's final wishes, but I can't allow her to damage valuable property while she's not thinking clearly." The way David looked at me made my skin crawl, not with hatred or anger, but with the calculating patience of someone waiting for an elderly woman to die naturally so he could collect his inheritance. His eyes held the same expression I'd seen in the eyes of nurses who worked with terminal patients, counting days until beds would become available. As dawnlight began creeping across the horizon, I heard the sound of bicycle tires on gravel. Through my bedroom window, I watched Tommy pedal frantically up my driveway, his small frame hunched over the handlebars as he rode through the early morning darkness. He dropped his bike and ran toward me, his face streaked with tears and his voice breaking with panic. He gasped, grabbing my arm with both hands. "I heard Mom and Dad talking this morning. They said if the lawyers stop them from getting the garage legally, they're going to make sure you can't keep it either." His next words came out in a terrified whisper that carried clearly in the morning air. "They're going to burn it down today, Grandma. They said accidents happen all the time in old buildings with electrical problems." I called Harold immediately, my fingers trembling as I dialed. Within minutes, he was at my house, and we were racing toward the garage with Sheriff Morrison's cruiser leading the way, sirens cutting through the morning air. Tommy's warning had given us precious time, but as we approached the garage, I realized we might already be too late. The volunteer fire department was already on scene when we arrived. Chief Patterson's team moved with the grim efficiency of professionals who'd seen this scenario too many times before. David and Jennifer were nowhere to be seen. Their cars were gone, the parking lot empty except for emergency vehicles and the evidence of what they'd almost accomplished. What Chief Patterson's team found confirmed Tommy's worst fears. Someone had poured gasoline in careful lines around the garage's foundation, the liquid soaking into the wooden trim and pooling dangerously near the electrical panel. Empty red gas cans lay scattered in the tall grass behind the building, their plastic surfaces still slick with accelerant residue. "This is professional work," Chief Patterson announced, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the scene. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. The pattern's designed to create maximum damage while making the fire look accidental. Another hour and this whole building would have been ash. But the most chilling discovery was what we found down the street. A A construction crew had been working since before dawn on what they claimed was a water main repair. Their equipment positioned less than 200 yards from the garage. The truck bore the logo, Webb Construction. Marcus Webb himself stood among the workers, his expensive suit incongruous among the men in hard hats and work boots. When our eyes met across the distance, he didn't look surprised or concerned about the near fire. He looked frustrated, like a man whose carefully orchestrated plan had been interrupted at the crucial moment. "Perfect positioning," Chief Patterson muttered, following my gaze. "They would have been the first ones on scene when the flames started. Perfect witnesses to swear they did everything possible to save the building." While Chief Patterson's team secured the scene and collected evidence, Harold made a discovery that turned my suspicions into horrifying certainty. He'd been studying the prescription receipts we'd found in James's safe, cross-referencing the medications with his phone's medical database. "Digitalis and propranolol," Harold explained, his voice tight with controlled fury. Dr. Mitchell confirmed that when these drugs are taken together, especially combined with alcohol, they trigger massive cardiac arrest in healthy individuals. The death appears completely natural unless an autopsy specifically tests for this exact combination. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Someone had slipped these drugs into James's coffee at the church potluck. Knowing his Tuesday routine, knowing he always had a single beer with dinner before heading to church. The timing had been calculated with medical precision. The drugs would hit his bloodstream just as he sat alone in our car. "The coffee cup," I whispered, remembering James's untouched dinner and the half-full mug he'd abandoned on the church table. "Do the paramedics still have it?" Harold was already making calls. Within 30 minutes, we had the confirmation that shattered any remaining doubt about natural causes. James's coffee cup, preserved as evidence from the paramedic response, tested positive for both digitalis and propranolol in concentrations that would have been fatal when mixed with alcohol. My husband had been murdered, deliberately poisoned by someone who knew his habits intimately enough to predict exactly when and where he would die. Sheriff Morrison's investigation expanded rapidly when he accessed Jennifer's work computer at the county clerk's office. Her digital trail read like a textbook for elder abuse and murder. Months of internet searches stretched back through her browser history. Undetectable poisons, inheritance laws, property transfer after death, legal precedents for family members claiming incompetency. Each search represented another step in Jennifer's methodical planning of James's death. But the most damning evidence came from her email correspondence with a contact identified only as Clean Slate Solutions. The message chain revealed a professional criminal organization that specialized in what they termed problem resolution for clients dealing with stubborn elderly relatives and complex inheritance situations. Their services menu included document forgery, witness intimidation, evidence disposal, and what they euphemistically called permanent solutions to ongoing difficulties. Jennifer's communications with them stretched back 6 months, sharing intimate details about James's health, his daily routines, his growing suspicion about their financial activities. The final email, sent just 3 days before James's death, contained a single, chilling line. Target confirmed, timeline accelerated, payment due upon completion. My daughter-in-law had hired professional killers to murder my husband. The morning sun climbed higher as Marcus Webb decided the situation required his direct intervention. He approached our group flanked by 3 men who wore business suits but moved with military precision. Webb's usually immaculate appearance showed stress fractures. His tie hung askew, perspiration stained his shirt collar despite the cool air, and his hands shook as he chain-smoked cigarette after cigarette. "Mr. Brennan," Webb said, his voice carrying forced authority that convinced no one. "There seems to be a serious misunderstanding about some property arrangements. Perhaps we should discuss this matter privately, away from all these distractions." Harold drew himself to full height, 40 years of courtroom experience evident in his bearing. "Mr. Webb, The only misunderstanding is your belief that murder and arson constitute legitimate business practices. Webb's professional facade cracked like ice under pressure. Murder? Arson? Those are extremely serious accusations, counselor. I hope you have substantial evidence to support such inflammatory claims. We have everything we need, Harold replied steadily, including your contractor's emails about hiring killers and your crew's convenient positioning for today's planned arson attack. Webb's mask shattered completely. His face flushed crimson with rage, and when he spoke, 15 years of accumulated arrogance and contempt poured out. You think some computer files and spilled gasoline constitute evidence? I've been operating successfully in this county for 15 years. I maintain productive relationships with judges who appreciate generous campaign contributions, prosecutors who understand pragmatic cooperation, and law enforcement officials who recognize that certain problems require discreet solutions. He brandished his phone, scrolling through contacts that included 2 county judges, the district attorney, and multiple state officials. Each name represented another node in the corruption network that had protected his criminal enterprise. I possess sufficient influence to bury you in legal proceedings for decades, Webb continued, his voice rising with each syllable. Your law license, your professional reputation, your comfortable retirement, I can obliterate all of it with strategic communications to the appropriate people. But Webb's threats revealed far more than he intended. This wasn't simple property theft. He was describing a sophisticated criminal operation protected by purchased officials and intimidated witnesses. The corruption reached deep into local government, creating an infrastructure that had enabled years of systematic elder abuse and murder. Harold's phone captured every incriminating word, recording evidence that would ultimately destroy not just Webb himself, but every official who'd accepted his blood money. As federal agents arrived to reinforce Sheriff Morrison's investigation and news crews gathered to document the unfolding scandal, I suddenly realized something that sent pure terror shooting through my chest. Tommy had vanished. I spun frantically, searching the crowd of firefighters, police officers, and federal agents for my grandson's familiar form. He'd been standing right beside me moments earlier, his small hand clutched in mine as we listened to the adults debate evidence and jurisdiction. "Tommy," I called out, my voice breaking with sudden panic. "Tommy, where are you?" Sheriff Morrison immediately began accounting for his personnel, radioing each deputy to confirm their current location and status. But when he reviewed the garage's security camera footage, what he discovered made everyone present understand the deadly serious stakes we were truly facing. At 9:42 a.m., while all adult attention focused on Webb's heated confrontation with Harold, a figure wearing a sheriff's deputy uniform had approached Tommy from behind. The individual wore mirrored sunglasses and consistently kept their face angled away from the security cameras, but their body language was wrong, too familiar, too casual with the frightened boy. Tommy had followed willingly, trusting what appeared to be a legitimate law enforcement officer, leading him toward a patrol car parked strategically beyond the camera's surveillance range. Sheriff Morrison had personally accounted for every one of his deputies. Every uniformed officer at the scene was present, legitimate and accounted for, which meant someone else had acquired a convincing replica uniform and had been observing, waiting patiently for the perfect opportunity to seize the one person whose loss would destroy me utterly. The security footage timestamp read 9:45 a.m. when the counterfeit patrol car departed with my grandson trapped inside, heading directly toward the interstate where tracking would become virtually impossible among the labyrinthine highway exchanges connecting our county to 3 neighboring states. Tommy had become a human bargaining chip in a game where the stakes were no longer mere property or money, but the lives of the only family I had remaining to protect. The fake patrol car's license plates came back stolen within minutes of Sheriff Morrison running them through the system. The Honda Civic had been reported missing 3 days earlier from a parking lot across town. The same day, Webb's threats had escalated to include James's final notice. Someone had been planning Tommy's kidnapping as backup leverage long before this morning's confrontation at the garage. Sheriff Morrison coordinated with downtown businesses to track the car's route through security cameras. The footage showed a clear trail through Main Street, past the courthouse, along Industrial Road, and finally disappearing into the network of rural highways that connected our county to 3 neighboring states. But the trail ended at an abandoned warehouse complex on the outskirts of town. Harold pulled up the property records on his phone while we raced toward the location in Sheriff Morrison's cruiser. The warehouse was owned by Industrial Holdings, LLC, which was owned by Mountain Development Corporation, which traced back to a shell company registered in Webb's name. The location hadn't been chosen randomly. It sat in a dead zone for cell phone coverage, surrounded by empty fields with no neighbors for miles in any direction. Perfect place to hold someone without being seen or heard, Sheriff Morrison muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Webb's been using this property for something, but we've never had cause to investigate. As we approached the warehouse complex, Sheriff Morrison's radio crackled with updates from his deputies. But something was wrong with the information flow. Details about our location and search strategy were being broadcast over channels that should have been secure, as if someone was monitoring police frequencies and relaying our movements to interested parties. "Morrison, this is Deputy Collins," came a voice through the radio static. "We've got the warehouse surrounded, but there's no sign of the vehicle or the kid. Might want to check the old Miller farm instead." Sheriff Morrison frowned and keyed his radio. "Collins, what's your current location?" "About 2 miles south of the warehouse, sir." Just following up on a tip. "Collins, you're supposed to be in court this morning testifying in the Henderson case. You shouldn't be anywhere near this investigation." The radio went silent. Sheriff Morrison exchanged a grim look with Harold in the passenger seat. "Someone's been listening to our communications," Morrison said. "Collins called in sick this morning, said he had the flu. But here he is, trying to redirect our search away from the warehouse." When we arrived at the actual warehouse complex, the scope of the corruption became even clearer. Evidence from the garage scene, the gas cans, the pharmacy receipts, Jennifer's forged documents had all disappeared from the sheriff's station overnight. The evidence room's security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned between midnight and 6 a.m., exactly when someone would have needed access to destroy the proof of their crimes. 2 more deputies, both of whom had been helping with the investigation, had submitted transfer requests that morning, asking to be moved to departments in other counties. Their sudden desire to leave wasn't coincidental. It was damage control by people who realized they'd been caught on the wrong side of a criminal conspiracy. "How deep does this go?" I asked Harold as we watched Sheriff Morrison coordinate with state police units he could actually trust. "Deeper than we thought," Harold replied, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke with contacts in the state attorney general's office. "I'm getting reports of similar patterns in 3 other counties. Elderly property owners dying under suspicious circumstances, always followed by quick property sales to development companies." The breakthrough came from Harold's conversation with Assistant Attorney General Patricia Mills, who'd been quietly investigating what she called inheritance acceleration schemes for the past 2 years. "Clean Slate Solutions isn't just a local operation," Harold explained after ending his call. "They're a multi-state criminal organization that specializes in eliminating obstacles to property development. They target elderly people who own valuable land, use family members as inside accomplices, and when persuasion fails, they move to intimidation, fraud, and murder." The pattern stretched back 5 years and across 4 states. Elderly couples who died within months of each other, always from natural-seeming causes. Widows who'd signed over valuable properties just weeks after their husbands' funerals. Family members who'd suddenly developed gambling debts or medical emergencies that required immediate cash from property sales. James wasn't their first victim, and I wouldn't be their last. The good news is that the State Attorney General's office has been building a RICO case against the entire organization, Harold continued. The bad news is that they need our evidence to make it stick, and that evidence is exactly what Webb is trying to destroy by eliminating witnesses. We were studying satellite images of the warehouse complex when a dusty pickup truck pulled into the parking lot beside us. The woman who climbed out looked like an older, wearier version of Jennifer, the same bone structure, the same way of holding her shoulders, but with gray hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent worrying about a daughter who'd gone wrong. "Are you Mrs. Thompson?" she asked, approaching our group with the determined stride of someone who'd driven a long way to deliver bad news. "I'm Eleanor Patterson, Jennifer's mother. I saw the news reports this morning about my daughter's arrest." Eleanor carried a worn canvas bag that looked like it had been packed in a hurry. She set it down on Sheriff Morrison's hood and began pulling out items that made my blood run cold-printed emails, bank statements, cell phone bills, and a small digital recorder. "I've been documenting Jennifer's behavior for 2 years," Eleanor said, her voice heavy with the shame of a mother who'd failed to stop her child's descent into criminality. She was stealing from elderly clients at her previous job in Columbus, forging checks and transferring property without authorization. I tried to get her help, tried to make her understand what she was doing, but she just got better at hiding it. The evidence Eleanor had gathered painted a picture of systematic elder abuse, stretching back years before Jennifer had ever met David or moved to our town. Bank records showed dozens of unauthorized withdrawals from accounts belonging to elderly clients. Forged documents transferred property from vulnerable seniors to shell companies Jennifer controlled. Voice recordings captured her bragging about how easy it was to manipulate confused old people into signing papers they didn't understand. "But the most important thing I brought is this," Eleanor said, holding up a photograph of a small cabin surrounded by dense woods. "This is my father's old hunting cabin, about 30 miles north of here. Jennifer knows about it because she used to hide there when she was in trouble as a teenager. If she's got that boy and she's feeling cornered, that's where she'll go." Eleanor's hands shook as she traced the photograph with one finger. The cabin sits on 40 acres of forest land, completely isolated from any neighbors. No cell phone service, no power lines, no way for anyone to hear what's happening unless they're right there. Jennifer always said it would be the perfect place to disappear if she ever needed to start over. Sheriff Morrison radioed for backup and emergency medical units, while Harold coordinated with the state police tactical team. But as we prepared for the 30-mile drive to the cabin, Eleanor grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Mrs. Thompson, you need to understand something about my daughter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jennifer doesn't handle failure well. When she feels trapped, when she realizes she can't talk or manipulate her way out of trouble, she becomes dangerous, not just to others, to herself, too." The drive through winding mountain roads felt endless, each curve potentially hiding the turnoff to the cabin where my grandson was being held. Sheriff Morrison's radio crackled with updates from the tactical team as they moved into position around Eleanor's father's property. "We have visual on the cabin," came the voice of Team Leader Rodriguez. "Single structure, windows covered from inside, one vehicle in the driveway matching the description of the stolen Honda. No movement visible from our current position." As we reached the staging area a quarter mile from the cabin, the reality of the situation hit me with devastating clarity. Through the trees, I could see smoke rising from the cabin's chimney, but it was too much smoke for a normal fire. Someone was burning papers, destroying evidence, preparing for a final confrontation. Team Leader Rodriguez approached with binoculars and a grim expression. "Ma'am, I need you to prepare yourself for what we're seeing through the windows." He handed me the binoculars and I focused them on the cabin's front window. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see Jennifer pacing back and forth in the main room, her movements frantic and erratic. A red gasoline can sat on the wooden table beside her, and Tommy was tied to a chair in the center of the room, his small frame dwarfed by the adult furniture around him. But what made my knees go weak was Jennifer's voice, carrying clearly through the thin cabin walls despite the distance. If I can't have the money, nobody gets anything, she screamed, her words echoing through the forest. Everything burns. Everything disappears. They can't prove anything if there's nothing left to find. The megaphone crackled to life in Detective Sarah Walsh's hands as she positioned herself behind the armored vehicle parked 50 yards from the cabin. Her voice carried across the forest clearing with the practiced calm of someone who'd talked desperate people off ledges for 15 years. Jennifer, this is Detective Walsh with the state police. I want you to know that Tommy is the only thing that matters to everyone out here. We're not interested in punishing anyone. We just want to make sure that little boy gets home safely to his grandmother. Through the binoculars, I watched Jennifer's silhouette move erratically behind the cabin's front window. She'd been pacing for 3 hours now, her movements growing more frantic as the afternoon wore on. The gasoline can remained on the table beside her, a constant threat that made every negotiation attempt feel like walking on broken glass. I want guaranteed immunity. Jennifer's voice shrieked from inside the cabin, her words echoing off the surrounding trees. Full immunity from prosecution, $1 million in cash, and I want everyone to admit that James Thompson got what he deserved. He was a greedy old man who wouldn't listen to reason. Detective Walsh keyed her radio quietly, speaking in codes that would keep Jennifer from understanding the tactical situation developing around the cabin. State police snipers had taken positions in the tree line, emergency medical units waited just outside the perimeter, and a helicopter circled high overhead with thermal imaging equipment tracking heat signatures inside the building. But Jennifer's demands revealed more than desperation. They revealed guilt. "Tell me about James, Jennifer," Detective Walsh called through the megaphone, her voice gentle but persistent. "Help me understand what happened at the church that night." "He was supposed to just get sick," Jennifer screamed back, her voice cracking with hysteria. "The pills were supposed to make him weak, confused, easy to manipulate. But the old fool had to drink that beer with dinner, had to make everything more complicated." My hands clenched into fists as I listened to Jennifer describe my husband's murder with the casual tone of someone discussing a failed recipe. The digitalis and propranolol in his coffee hadn't been meant to kill him immediately. They'd been designed to weaken him gradually, making him appear mentally incompetent so David could take control of his affairs legally. "The heart attack was an accident," Jennifer continued, her voice growing shriller, "but it solved our problem faster than the original plan. We were going to have that old woman committed within a week of the funeral. Senile dementia, unable to manage her affairs, dangerous to herself. David had already found a nice facility that would keep her comfortable while we handled the estate." Detective Walsh glanced back at me with an expression that mixed professional composure with personal disgust. Even for someone who'd seen the worst of human behavior, listening to a daughter-in-law casually discuss murdering her husband and institutionalizing his widow was clearly taking a toll. "Jennifer, what about Tommy?" Detective Walsh asked, steering the conversation toward the immediate crisis. "He's just a little boy. He doesn't understand any of this adult business." "Tommy understands more than you think," Jennifer replied, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than her screaming. "He's been recording conversations on that tablet of his for months. Smart little boy, too smart for his own good, but children have accidents all the time." The casual way she discussed harming her own son made my stomach turn. This wasn't just greed or desperation. It was something fundamentally broken in Jennifer's capacity to feel human connection or empathy. The sound of approaching vehicles made everyone in the tactical command area turn toward the access road. David's BMW sedan pulled up to the perimeter, followed by 2 black SUVs that screamed federal law enforcement. But David's behavior as he climbed out of his car revealed everything about his true priorities. Instead of running toward the cabin where his son was being held hostage, instead of demanding updates on Tommy's condition or volunteering to help with negotiations, David headed straight for the command vehicle where Sheriff Morrison was coordinating with the state police. "Has she said anything about the business arrangements?" David asked, his voice tight with worry that had nothing to do with his child's safety. About the financial records or the other properties? Sheriff Morrison stared at David with the expression of a man watching someone reveal their true nature in the worst possible moment. Your son is tied up in a cabin with a woman threatening to burn it down, and you're asking about business records. David's mask slipped completely. You don't understand the scope of what's at stake here. Jennifer knows things that could destroy dozens of legitimate business deals, could implicate people who had nothing to do with these unfortunate events. He pulled out his phone and stepped away from the group, his voice dropping to urgent whispers as he spoke to someone on the other end. But the acoustics of the forest clearing carried his words clearly to those of us listening. She's lost it completely, David said into the phone. No, I can't control her anymore. The kid is expendable, if it comes to that. We always knew this was a possibility. He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. Yes, I understand the timeline. Clean slate protocols if necessary. Sheriff Morrison's radio crackled with an urgent message from the perimeter teams. 3 more vehicles had been spotted approaching from different directions, but they weren't law enforcement. The occupants were armed, professional, and moving with military precision toward positions that would give them clear lines of sight on both the cabin and the command area. This is Morrison, the sheriff called into his radio. All units be advised we have unknown armed individuals taking positions around the perimeter. Treat as hostile until confirmed otherwise. Marcus Webb's voice cut through the forest clearing like a blade as he emerged from the tree line with 2 men carrying high-powered rifles. His expensive suit looked out of place in the wilderness setting, but his cold professionalism fit perfectly with the mercenaries flanking him. Sheriff Morrison, I think it's time we resolve this situation efficiently, Webb called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. My associates are here to provide specialized consultation on the safe recovery of the hostage. But the positioning of Webb's associates told a different story. The sniper who'd taken position on the ridge had clear shots at both the cabin's front window and the law enforcement command area. The second gunman had moved to block the access road, cutting off retreat routes for anyone who might want to leave with inconvenient information. This isn't a rescue operation, Harold whispered to me, his face pale with understanding. This is an elimination protocol. Webb's going to kill everyone. Jennifer, Tommy, the witnesses, maybe even the law enforcement officers who know too much. Detective Walsh must have reached the same conclusion because she immediately radioed for additional backup and ordered the tactical teams to reposition for a potential firefight. But Webb's next words confirmed our worst fears. Jennifer Patterson is a mentally unstable individual who's been stealing from elderly clients for years, Webb announced, his voice projected to carry to all the law enforcement personnel within hearing range. She's murdered at least 1 person, kidnapped a child, and is now threatening to commit murder-suicide. My associates are here to prevent further loss of life through precision intervention. The euphemisms couldn't hide the reality. Webb planned to have his sniper kill Jennifer and Tommy both, then claim it was necessary to prevent the deaths of law enforcement officers. Any witnesses who might contradict his version of events would face similar precision interventions in the confusion that followed. But Jennifer, watching through the cabin window, must have recognized Webb's arrival for what it really was, the moment her criminal partners decided she'd become more liability than asset. Her scream of rage echoed across the forest clearing. "You bastard! You said if anything went wrong, you'd get me out. You promised I'd be protected." Webb's response was delivered with the casual cruelty of a businessman canceling an unprofitable contract. Business arrangements change, Jennifer. Market conditions require restructuring. That single word, restructuring, broke whatever remaining control Jennifer had been maintaining. She began screaming confessions that would have destroyed Webb's entire operation if anyone survived to testify about them. Judge Morrison took $50,000 to fast-track property transfers. Dr. Henderson prescribed medications to patients who didn't need them. Clean Slate Solutions has bodies buried in 3 states. Her voice carried across the forest like a tornado of incriminating evidence. The Riverside Nursing Home, the Oakdale Development Project, the municipal airport expansion, all of it was built on murdered property owners. She rattled off bank account numbers in the Cayman Islands, safe deposit box locations in 3 cities, and the real names of officials who'd been taking bribes for years. Each revelation would have been enough to destroy a career or send someone to prison for decades. But Webb's patience had run out. He signaled to his sniper, who raised his rifle toward the cabin window. Sheriff Morrison, recognizing the imminent massacre, made a split-second decision that probably saved all our lives. Instead of trying to arrest Webb's team or negotiate a peaceful resolution, he activated the emergency frequency that connected him directly to the state police helicopter overhead. Air Unit, this is Ground Command. We have armed hostiles threatening law enforcement personnel. Request immediate tactical support. The helicopter's response was swift and decisive. Instead of maintaining its surveillance altitude, it dropped rapidly toward the forest clearing, its rotor wash creating a windstorm that scattered leaves and debris across the entire area. The pilot's voice crackled through every radio in the command area. All ground units take cover. Armed individuals with sniper rifles are not law enforcement personnel. Repeat, unknown gunmen are targeting both the cabin and the command area. Webb's associates found themselves pinned down by helicopter searchlights and unable to maintain their shooting positions in the artificial hurricane created by the aircraft's rotors. Their carefully planned ambush dissolved into chaos as they tried to retreat while maintaining cover from the aerial surveillance. But inside the cabin, Jennifer's breakdown reached its final devastating climax. Through the binoculars, I watched her grab the gasoline can and hurl it against the cabin's far wall with the fury of someone who'd realized she'd been betrayed by everyone she'd trusted. The impact shattered the metal container, splashing gasoline across the wooden walls and floor. The liquid caught fire immediately from the cabin's oil heater, and orange flames began spreading through the single room with terrifying speed. But in that moment of Jennifer's rage and destruction, something miraculous happened. Tommy, who'd been sitting motionless in his chair for hours, revealed that he'd been working steadily to free himself from his bonds. The rope that had seemed to secure him to the chair fell away as he rolled toward the cabin's back wall, disappearing into the smoke that was already beginning to fill the small space. The flames spread faster than anyone could have imagined, feeding on the old wooden structure and the accelerant Jennifer had provided. Within seconds, the entire front wall was engulfed, and smoke poured through every gap in the building's construction. I strained my eyes against the growing inferno, searching desperately for any sign of my grandson among the orange light and black smoke that was consuming the cabin. But Tommy had vanished completely into the chaos, leaving me to wonder if he'd escaped through a back window or was trapped somewhere in the burning building where no one could reach him. A small hand pushed up through the charred wooden boards behind the burning cabin, followed by Tommy's soot-covered face as he emerged from what looked like solid ground. The boy had found the old root cellar that Eleanor's father had dug decades ago for storing vegetables through harsh winters, an underground refuge that had saved his life when the cabin erupted in flames above him. Emergency medical technicians rushed forward as Tommy crawled away from the smoking ruins, his clothes singed, but his grip firm on the tablet computer he'd somehow managed to protect throughout the ordeal. His first words weren't about his own safety or the terrifying hours he'd spent as Jennifer's hostage. "Grandma, I saved Grandpa's evidence," he said, holding up the device with trembling but determined hands. "I've been recording everything for months, just like he taught me to do." The tablet's screen was cracked but functional, and as Tommy navigated through folders of audio and video files, the scope of his secret project became clear. This 10-year-old boy had been documenting his parents' criminal conspiracy with the methodical precision his grandfather had taught him during their weekend visits to the garage. Grandpa told me that when adults do bad things, someone has to keep records, Tommy explained to Detective Walsh, his voice steady despite the trauma he'd endured. He said evidence was like putting together a puzzle. You need all the pieces to see the whole picture. The recordings Tommy had gathered painted that picture in devastating detail. Conversations between David and Jennifer discussing which elderly neighbors owned valuable property. Phone calls with Marcus Webb outlining strategies for pressuring seniors into selling below market value. Planning sessions where they calculated how much medication would be needed to weaken James without killing him too quickly. But the most heartbreaking files were the conversations between Tommy and his grandfather during those final weeks. James had suspected his son's involvement in something criminal, but he'd needed proof before taking action that would destroy his family. Tommy had become his willing accomplice, recording evidence while pretending to play games on his tablet. Grandpa knew they were planning something bad, Tommy said, scrolling through video files that showed David forging documents at the kitchen table. He told me to keep recording everything no matter what happened to him. He said someday I'd need to protect you, Grandma. James's voice emerged from the tablet speakers, recorded just 5 days before his death during one of his secret conversations with Tommy in the garage workshop. Son, if something happens to me, you make sure Grandma gets this evidence. Don't trust your parents. Don't trust anyone except Grandma and Mr. Brennan, the lawyer. Promise me you'll be brave when the time comes. Tommy's young voice responded with the solemnity of a child who understood he was being given a sacred responsibility. I promise, Grandpa. I won't let them hurt Grandma. The recordings revealed James's final weeks in heartbreaking detail. He discovered David's forgeries when his son had borrowed money using fraudulent documents that bore James's signature. Instead of confronting David directly, James had begun his own investigation, documenting the pattern of elder abuse that stretched across multiple counties. Your grandfather was building a case, Harold explained as we listened to James's recorded notes about Webb's operation. He'd identified at least 12 other elderly victims, tracked financial transactions through multiple shell companies, and documented the involvement of corrupt officials. He was planning to turn everything over to the FBI after he'd secured legal protection for you. But Jennifer had discovered James's investigation before he could complete it. The recordings captured her panicked phone call to Webb, reporting that the old man knows too much, and we need to accelerate the timeline. James's death hadn't been a crime of passion or desperation. It had been a calculated murder designed to eliminate a threat to their operation. The evidence Tommy had preserved went far beyond his family's crimes. His tablet contained recordings of Webb's conversations with corrupt officials, detailed plans for acquiring property through intimidation and fraud, and even discussions about disposing of evidence at a remote quarry site 30 miles outside town. Webb's desperation became apparent as state police units arrived with federal agents, responding to what Detective Walsh later learned was an anonymous tip sent from Tommy's tablet hours earlier. While pretending to be Jennifer's helpless hostage, the boy had been systematically uploading evidence to cloud storage services, social media platforms, and news outlets throughout the morning. I sent everything to the FBI, the state police, and the newspapers, Tommy explained, his 10-year-old voice carrying pride in his technical abilities. Grandpa taught me about backup systems. He said important information should always be stored in multiple places. But Webb wasn't finished. As federal agents moved to arrest his associates and corrupt local officials, he made one final desperate play for control. Mayor Patricia Henderson stepped forward from the crowd of officials who'd been observing the standoff, her usually composed political facade cracking under pressure. Instead of supporting law enforcement efforts, she announced that the ongoing crisis required immediate emergency powers. I'm declaring a state of emergency for this county, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone reading from a script Webb had provided. All evidence related to this incident must be secured by emergency management personnel to prevent tampering or destruction. Police Chief Robert Collins appeared beside her, his hand resting on his service weapon as he faced Sheriff Morrison with unconcealed hostility. "Sheriff, you're hereby relieved of authority in this matter. Emergency protocols are now in effect." County Judge Margaret Fitzgerald emerged from a black sedan that had been parked just outside the perimeter, carrying official-looking documents that she claimed gave Webb's people legal authority to seize all evidence and control the crime scene. The corruption had reached deeper than any of us had imagined. Webb had spent years building a network of compromised officials who could be activated when his operation faced exposure. Mayor, police chief, county judge, all of them revealing their true allegiances in a coordinated attempt to help Webb escape justice. But their conspiracy had one fatal flaw. They'd underestimated a 10-year-old boy's determination to honor his grandfather's memory. Tommy held up his tablet, showing the federal agents that his evidence uploads had been completed hours earlier. Every recording, every document, every piece of proof was already in the hands of authorities who couldn't be bought or intimidated by local corruption. "It's too late," Tommy announced with the clear voice of a child who'd found courage he didn't know he possessed. "The whole world already knows what you did." News trucks were arriving on the access road, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky to broadcast the story that would destroy Webb's empire. Social media feeds showed Tommy's evidence being shared thousands of times per minute. FBI field offices in 3 states were coordinating raids on properties owned by Webb's shell companies. The empire Webb had spent 15 years building was crumbling in real time, and everyone present could see the panic in his eyes as he realized that all his bought judges and corrupt officials couldn't stop information that had already escaped into the digital world. Webb's final move came with the desperate violence of a cornered animal. He lunged toward Sheriff Morrison's service weapon, wrestling it free during the confusion of competing jurisdictions and conflicting orders. Emergency personnel scattered as Webb backed toward the smoking ruins of the cabin, his stolen gun trained on the crowd of witnesses. "Everyone stays back!" Webb shouted, his usual professional composure completely shattered. "I want safe passage out of here. No tracking devices, no pursuit. I disappear cleanly, or everyone here dies with me." But as Webb retreated toward the burned cabin, he grabbed my arm with his free hand, pulling me against him as a human shield. The barrel of Sheriff Morrison's pistol pressed cold against my temple as Webb positioned us both among the charred wooden beams and still smoking debris. "This is how it ends, old woman," Webb whispered in my ear, his voice carrying the bitter rage of a man watching his life's work destroyed by a child with a tablet computer. "You and your husband thought you were so smart, but all you've done is ensure that everyone you love pays the price for your interference." The ruins of the cabin surrounded us like a tomb, the acrid smell of smoke and gasoline filling the air as Webb made his final demand, not for money or property or power, but for the one thing his criminal empire had never been able to buy: the chance to disappear completely, leaving no trace of his crimes or his victims. The cold steel of Sheriff Morrison's gun pressed against my temple as Webb backed us deeper into the smoking ruins of the cabin. News cameras captured every moment as he positioned himself behind me, using my body as a shield while federal agents and state police surrounded the perimeter with weapons drawn. But Webb had made a critical miscalculation. He expected me to cower, to plead for my life, to give him the terrified elderly victim he could use as leverage in his final negotiation. Instead, he found himself holding a woman who'd survived her husband's murder, her family's betrayal, and months of psychological warfare designed to break her spirit. "You want to know what your real mistake was, Marcus?" I said, my voice carrying clearly across the forest clearing to the cameras and microphones, recording every word. You thought James was just a foolish old man, and you thought I was just a helpless widow. But we were partners for 43 years. He taught me everything about patience, about planning, about never giving up when something matters. Webb's hand trembled against the gun as I continued speaking, broadcasting his crimes to the world through live television coverage. You murdered my husband with digitalis and propranolol because he discovered your network of elder abuse. You bribed Judge Morrison, Police Chief Collins, and Mayor Henderson to cover your tracks. You've been killing elderly property owners for 5 years, stealing their land and destroying their families. My voice grew stronger with each revelation. But the evidence is already out there, Marcus. Tommy made sure of that. Your empire is finished. I could feel Webb's growing panic in the way his breathing quickened, in the tremor that ran through his body as he realized his situation was hopeless. The gun wavered slightly, and I knew his control was slipping. James left you a final gift, I continued, turning my head slightly to meet Webb's eyes. He believed everyone deserved a chance at redemption, even people who'd lost their way. You can confess now, publicly, on camera. You can help the families of your victims find closure. You can choose to do one decent thing before this ends. Webb's response was a roar of pure rage that echoed off the surrounding trees. Your husband was a sanctimonious old fool, and you're just as stupid as he was. None of this matters. I have enough money hidden offshore to disappear forever. His fury consumed what remained of his self-control. Instead of using me as leverage for negotiation, Webb shoved me away and raised the gun toward the federal agents surrounding us. But his arrogance had cost him his only protection, and the tactical team's response was immediate and decisive. Webb's criminal empire didn't collapse through legal proceedings. It imploded through the power of truth, spoken publicly by people he'd underestimated. The courthouse proceedings that followed became a media sensation, but the real justice happened through personal reckonings that cut deeper than any legal punishment. David's downfall came when Tommy was called to testify about his father's crimes. My 10-year-old grandson walked to the witness stand with the same determined stride he'd used to emerge from that burning cabin, and his words carried the devastating honesty that only children possess. My dad used to be a good person, Tommy said, his young voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. He taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with homework and read me stories at bedtime. But then he started doing bad things for money, and he forgot how to be good. The boy's testimony wasn't accusatory or angry. It was simply truthful. He described David's gambling addiction with the clinical precision of a child who'd watched his father destroy himself bet by bet. He recounted conversations where David discussed eliminating obstacles to their financial security, including his own father and mother-in-law. Dad said Grandpa was too stubborn and Grandma was too old to understand business, Tommy continued, tears streaming down his face. He said sometimes you have to make hard choices to protect your family. But he was wrong. You don't protect your family by hurting people. Grandpa taught me that. David sat at the defendant's table, his face buried in his hands as his son's words stripped away every justification, every rationalization he'd constructed for his crimes. Watching his gambling addiction, his cowardice in enabling murder, and his willingness to sacrifice family for money exposed on national television, David finally understood what he'd become. His collapse in the courtroom wasn't an act designed to gain sympathy. It was genuine horror at seeing himself clearly for the first time in years. The man who'd convinced himself he was a victim of circumstances faced the reality that he'd been an active participant in destroying everything he claimed to love. Jennifer's punishment proved more complex than simple imprisonment. Her mother, Eleanor's testimony revealed a lifetime pattern of manipulation, theft, and betrayal that extended far beyond James's murder. Former employers came forward with stories of embezzlement and fraud. Elderly clients from her previous job described how she'd forged documents and stolen their savings. Even childhood friends testified about Jennifer's history of lying and stealing. But the most devastating blow came when prosecutors introduced Jennifer's social media presence as evidence. Her carefully curated Instagram account, designed to project success and happiness, became a catalog of evidence against her. Photos of expensive jewelry and designer clothes were matched against timelines of her thefts from elderly clients. Posts about family vacations coincided with periods when she'd been planning James's murder. The woman who'd built her entire identity on appearances lost everything that mattered to her: reputation, relationships, and respect. Former friends crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Social media followers who'd envied her lifestyle now knew it was built on the suffering of vulnerable seniors. The carefully constructed facade of success crumbled, leaving nothing but the criminal acts that had always been hidden underneath. Webb's personal devastation cut deeper than any legal consequences the court could impose. His sophisticated criminal network collapsed as his corruption exposed dozens of officials who'd enabled his crimes for years. Judges lost their positions, police chiefs resigned in disgrace, and government workers faced federal charges for their roles in the conspiracy. But Webb's most crushing defeat came through a handwritten letter that his elderly mother, Catherine Webb, had mailed to the court before his sentencing hearing. The prosecutor read Mrs. Webb's words aloud in the packed courtroom, her voice carrying across the silence as Webb's own mother disowned him completely. "To the families of my son's victims," the letter began, "I am writing this with a broken heart to express my shame for the monster I raised. For 87 years, I believed I had been blessed with a successful son who made his living through honest business. Learning the truth about Marcus's crimes has destroyed that belief and shown me that I failed as a mother in the most fundamental way possible." The letter continued with devastating precision, describing Mrs. Webb's horror at discovering her son had built his wealth by murdering elderly people like herself. She announced her intention to donate Marcus's entire inheritance to a fund for elder abuse victims, ensuring he would receive nothing from the family that had given him every advantage in life. "I hope my son lives to be very old," the letter concluded, "so that he can experience the vulnerability and fear he inflicted on so many innocent people. I pray that God forgives him, because I cannot." Webb's face crumpled as his mother's words echoed through the courtroom. The man who'd spent 15 years building a criminal empire found himself stripped of everything: money, power, respect, and finally, the love of the one person who'd believed in his innocence. But the wider community's response completed the circle of justice in ways the legal system alone could never achieve. James's memory, initially overshadowed by the scandal of his murder, was restored as his heroic investigation became public knowledge. The garage where he'd secretly documented Webb's crimes became a memorial, not just to his craftsmanship, but to his courage in protecting others from predators who targeted the vulnerable. Webb's other victims across 3 states found justice as his assets were liquidated to compensate families he'd destroyed. The quarry where his organization had disposed of evidence yielded the remains of 5 elderly property owners whose deaths had been ruled natural. Their families finally had closure, and their murderers faced justice. The system that had been corrupted was slowly rebuilt, stronger for having faced its failures. New oversight procedures protected elderly property owners from predatory developers. Enhanced background checks prevented criminals from infiltrating county clerk offices and judicial positions. Tommy's evidence had exposed not just individual crimes, but systemic weaknesses that could be strengthened. 6 months after that terrible night at the burning cabin, I stood in James's restored garage, now officially renamed the James Thompson Elder Protection Center. The vintage cars gleamed under new lighting, each one a testament to my husband's patient craftsmanship and hidden strength. The financial settlement from Webb's seized assets had given me choices I'd never imagined having. I could sell the property and live comfortably on the proceeds, disappearing into the quiet retirement James and I had always planned. The garage keys felt heavy in my palm as I considered that possibility. A simple life, free from the memories of murder and betrayal that haunted this place. But James had left me more than just money and property. He'd shown me that some fights were worth having, that protecting others from predators was worth the risk of becoming a target yourself. Tommy appeared beside me, his small hand slipping into mine as we studied the memorial wall where photos of Webb's victims hung alongside James's portrait. My grandson had grown up too quickly in the past months, but he'd also discovered strength and courage that would serve him throughout his life. "What are you going to do with Grandpa's garage, Grandma?" Tommy asked, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned that adults didn't always make good choices. I looked around the workshop where James had spent his final years building something beautiful while secretly documenting something terrible. The choice wasn't really about money or property. It was about whether his legacy would be preserved or abandoned, whether his courage would inspire others or be forgotten. The garage keys caught the afternoon sunlight as I made my decision, their metal surfaces reflecting the promise of purpose that extended far beyond revenge or justice, reaching toward the kind of protection and care that James had always believed the vulnerable deserved. 6 months later, I stood in the restored garage under the gleaming sign that read, James and Frank Thompson Automotive Heritage Center. The vintage cars caught the afternoon light like jewels, each chrome bumper polished to mirror brightness, each paint job flawless as the day it rolled off the assembly line. What had started as James's secret project had become something larger, a memorial that honored both brothers' passion for beautiful machinery and honest craftsmanship. The financial numbers had exceeded everyone's expectations, $800,000. The garage and its restored vehicles were worth more than David and Jennifer had ever dreamed when they'd plotted to steal everything from us. But their plan had always been about taking, not building. They'd never understood that some things couldn't be measured in bank accounts. I'd made different choices than the ones greed would have dictated. 3 cars went to the local automotive museum, where school children could learn about the patience and skill required to restore something broken, back to beauty. The scholarship fund I'd established in James's name would help young mechanics learn trades that honored craftsmanship over quick profits. 2 vehicles remained mine, the Thunderbird he'd restored for my birthday, and the Mustang that had become my symbol of survival. David had served 18 months in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy. When he was released, he'd found the world had moved on without him. Jennifer had divorced him, taken what money remained, and fled to another state where her reputation hadn't yet followed her through news coverage and social media. Tommy had chosen to live with Eleanor, his maternal grandmother, rather than return to the father who'd valued money more than family. Jennifer's new life in Arizona hadn't provided the fresh start she'd expected. Her carefully curated social media presence had become a permanent record of her crimes, shared and reshared by people who wanted others to recognize the face of elder abuse. The debts she'd left behind in Ohio followed her across state lines, and the nursing homes where she'd tried to find work had learned to search for her real name online. Marcus Webb's 5-year sentence had been only the beginning of his punishment. Civil judgments had stripped him of every asset, every property, every dollar he'd stolen from vulnerable seniors. His sophisticated criminal network had collapsed like a house of cards once Tommy's evidence exposed the connections between corrupt officials. The FBI now used Webb's case as a training model for recognizing elder fraud patterns. But the most profound change had been in me. The ordeal had revealed strength I'd never known I possessed, courage I'd never needed to summon before James's death forced me to fight for everything we'd built together. The helpless widow my family had expected me to become had never actually existed. She'd been their projection, their assumption, their fatal miscalculation. On quiet Tuesday evenings, I sat in James's office reading his journal entries by the light of his old desk lamp. His presence filled every carefully planned detail of this place, every tool arranged with precision, every restoration documented with loving attention. He'd known I would need this sanctuary, this proof that my worth extended far beyond being someone's wife or mother. Tommy visited every Tuesday after school, his small hands learning to hold wrenches properly, his eager questions about engine timing and carburetor adjustments echoing the curiosity James had always encouraged. The boy had inherited his grandfather's mechanical aptitude and his grandmother's fierce loyalty to family, real family, the kind built on love rather than opportunity. Every weekend I drove the restored Mustang through our town with the windows down and my silver hair flying in the wind. The engine's rumble carried James's approval through every street, past every neighbor who waved with new respect. Everyone knew now Maggie Thompson was nobody's victim. Sometimes I wondered if James had somehow sensed what David and Jennifer were planning. His preparations had been too thorough, his legal protections too specific to be mere coincidence. Maybe 43 years of marriage had taught him to anticipate dangers I couldn't see, to build shelters for futures I couldn't imagine. The garage stood as proof that some legacies couldn't be stolen, manipulated, or destroyed by greed. James's devotion to craftsmanship, his faith in my strength, his 43 years of patient love, these had created something more valuable than any property deed or bank account. As autumn painted the Ohio landscape in brilliant reds and golds, I locked the garage door and walked toward my car, the keys heavy with purpose in my palm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries about the woman I was still becoming at 71 years old. James would have been proud.